Morning, everybody. How we doing today? We're up in the office today. The record room's a little bit disheveled right now. There's equipment everywhere. There's a fine layer of dust on everything because my son turned on the shop vac and the filter fell off inside, so it was just blowing the contents of said shop vac all over. I'm glad the record cabinets are there and closed, protecting the vinyl. Everything else will need a good dusting and cleaning before we go forward with anything. But the plumbers are coming Monday to drill core, use a core drill down to hopefully find shine or something. But yeah, so we're gonna shoot these next couple episodes up here today, and probably next Monday or Tuesday do part 2 of this. What I wanted to do was kind of outline a dozen important records from every decade of my life. Being 50 means I've made it through 5 decades, obviously. And I think each decade had growing pains and spurts, and it's part of the process and the journey that gets you to where you eventually reside as a fan of music and what you love. And some people's journey stays very narrow. My brother Paul still listens to a lot of stuff we listened to in high school. My brother David, his range of music is fairly broad, especially in his mind, although it's excluding huge volumes of the history. He likes a lot of niche stuff. My brother Tim probably has the broadest range, but just the four of us alone illustrates how different people's musical tastes evolve and grow, and how much music is part of your life. I think it dictates some of that, how much time you're going to spend and dedicate to learning about music and diving into music and connecting with it and understanding what is your poison, what is your pill, what do you need for you to enjoy it and to kind of get off. What gets you off musically is kind of the journey that we all end up being on. And it's a journey we don't really enjoy until we start dismissing the cavalcade of voices telling us what we should like. It's not until we kind of make our own choices and our own decisions and disregard the things we're supposed to like and actually discover what we do like. And there's a few epiphany and aha moments for me along the way. So without any further ado, I do want to say thank you to Chris and Mike and Felipe. They had me on their live stream last night, the Jazz Bums. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. A lot of fun talking with some other jazz cats and, just sharing and bantering back and forth. And I look forward to doing that again. And hopefully I'll have a little more notice next time. I can put a little notice on my YouTube channel, maybe the Facebook group as well, and let people know that, hey, we're going to be streaming on the Jazz Bums live stream once in a while. So that was fun and it was a good time. Good. Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it very much. Appreciate all the kind words as well. It's nice to see people do value what the channel offers, in spite of the channel not growing like other channels around it that have similar content but deal more with the superficial. Watching some of those channels explode in subscribers, and we're just moving along here with our little viewership and our little, but we're fine. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. So, my first decade of my life, I was raised by 2 immigrant parents. My mom came from England in 1945. She left London during the war, at the end of the war. The hospital she was born in 1945 was bombed shortly after they'd left, her and her mother, my grandmother. And my dad used to always joke, for some people they break the mold. For you, they bombed the hospital, which was always a great holiday moment to cheer. We heard that joke many, many a time. Rest in peace, Dad. I love you, miss you. But yeah, my dad came from Holland in 1942. He was born in 42 in Holland. During the occupation by the Nazis, his parents actually hid out some Jewish neighbors of theirs at times. They remembered stories of the Nazi soldiers taking people's livestock and stuff, which, I mean, I'm not condemning anybody. That's part of how war functions. But those kids were probably just as hungry as the Dutch people who lived there, if not hungrier probably, depending on what time of the war we're talking about. But that aside, they were both kind of poor immigrants. And my mom had an education and was actually a school teacher. And my father dropped out after grade 6 and was a skilled carpenter, but was never really versed in uh, any of the philosophies or the sciences. And he found religion, and my mom did as well, and they kind of went full evangelical. And at some point, I guess you can stop your own questioning if you just adopt a belief system and a doctrine, which is what my father definitely did. And my mom kind of just was just as evangelical as my dad. I think she's moderated some since my dad's passing 3 years ago, but she's still, obviously full-blooded evangelical. But it's part of my path and my journey, and part of what shaped my life. And some of the difficulties I had fitting in is a lot of who I am and why I have empathy for groups who struggle. I've been through some tough times, and that value changes who you are, changes what you believe in, and who you side with. And the underdog has meaning when you've gone through some tough times yourself. So the first 10 years of my life, from 1972 through 1981, my memories of music are quite jaded, I think, compared to most people. And I don't know how many people at 50 have very clear memories of albums they listened to when they were under 10. But for me, the first thing was always, there was hymns around our house all the time, and Christmas carols was kind of part of that. There was some Christian contemporary music. And you had stuff like Michael W. Smith, Amy Grant, Scott Wesley Brown. And they had little elements of some spirit and soul to them, but they were pretty blanched. They were pretty soulless. And to me, that's one of the ultimate ironies of Christian contemporary music, is for music that's supposed to be based in some kind of spirituality, it often lacks spirituality, far more so than a band like AC/DC, who's bleeding the blues. The lack of sincerity and the amount of posturing and trying to emulate the secular in sound and look, it kind of conflicts with your message at times. And I think it ends up becoming such a product that it strips a lot of its content of depth and meaning and value away from it. And so a lot of Christian contemporary music to me is such bland baby food. Oh, it's kind of like 80s and 90s country music. It's just so banal and without any flair, and the music is just not good. I mean, it's produced well, but it lacks any feeling, any guts, any blues, any soul. And I find some like contemporary country music from the 90s and 2000s to sound like bland praise and worship music almost. It's just, my brother listens to it at the shop sometimes where I help out over there, and I find some of it just really, really awful. And then some old Johnny Cash or Hank Williams comes on, and you're like, well, that's country music. That's got some soul to it, But so that's what was around my house, was some of that Christian contemporary music, and there's a lot of it that I couldn't begin to remember. My mom listened to some Jewish Israeli folk records. She went to the Holy Land in 70, I believe, or 71, right after the 6-Day War. She came back with a certain degree of evangelism and empathy for the Israeli plight. Also, because of her evangelical hard right-wing beliefs, she doesn't have any empathy for the Palestinians, which is the irony of staunch beliefs, is you get to select who you have empathy for. And my Creator made all people, and I have empathy for all of this humanity. And doctrines can be very dogmatic and exclude those who don't kneel or pray the same way. But yeah, there was Jewish folk records in the house. I remember her playing some of that stuff. Mario Lanza, the Italian crooner singer, from somewhat operatic to kind of pop Italian songs to songs of the day. We had a number of Mario Lanza records, and he has a powerful voice. I do remember Handel's Messiah, along with some other, once in a while Vivaldi, Four Seasons, and some classical stuff here and there. My Beethoven, Ode to Joy kind of stuff. But Mozart was even kind of secular for my parents for some reason. And again, they were never very into music in that regard if it was outside of the church. My parents were so church related. I remember hearing stuff like Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and that was the kind of stuff we would sing around the house. I remember singing stuff like Tradition from Fiddler on the Roof around the house. The Disney films, Baloo from the Jungle Book. Those type of songs had, was what my mom wanted us exposed to and what we really heard a lot of. Harry Belafonte was one of the first real secular people I was privy to getting to know. And that was because my grandpa, my mom's father, had some Harry Belafonte records, and when he passed, we inherited them, and I would play them. And it was like, oh, this is interesting, this is different. And even Belafonte had more soul than most of the music my parents would listen to. Even as a young age, I could feel it in some of what Belafonte was saying and doing. And there was also some Nat King Cole in the house as well. And so when you heard Unforgettable and when you heard some of the early stuff, it had a different feel to it. Even though it's kind of as watered down as black music can get in some ways, it was still tangibly different to my young ears. So that's kind of what we were exposed to in the house. And there was no internet, of course, in the 70s. Radio was something that my parents didn't really have on ever. They would have Christian TV on sometimes. So a song had to be really massive for it to reach my ears, if it was a secular hit. And so an example of a song like that would be Copacabana. That song was so big that it bled out of everyone's speakers for a while. And so you couldn't really be alive, even in Canada. We were probably in Manitoba. We were in Ontario and Manitoba during this period. And I remember hearing Copacabana pretty commonly. Probably made it on some TV programs as well at the time. But that's an example of the kind of song that would cross over and it would make it to my eardrums. That was secular in the first 10 years of my life. And it was after that next 10 years, which is part 2 now of this episode, where things started to become more my own content. And being a preacher's kid, there's a certain amount of expectation of rebellion. And every young man rebels against his parents regardless. But being a preacher's kid gives you an extra level of indignation and probably a certain degree of rude disrespect to your parents as well. But again, that's part of being a preacher's kid. So from the ages of 10 to 20, there was a lot of music that filled my eardrums. But there was only certain records that were really influential and really are mile markers for me. And it starts off with Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil. And I was living 2 lives at that point in terms of my relationship with my parents and my relationship with the world. We had to sneak secular music into the house and listen to it in the barn with a little cassette deck with batteries in it, listening to In the Beginning, Shout the Devil, Looks Like Kill. And it felt good as a 13, 14-year-old young man to find that rebellious music. It just connected. And it's not a great record. It's not great musicianship by any means, but it just was symbolic for me. And it really, it was a powerful record for me, and it stood where I stood. It represented something I felt at that point. My need to be independent, my need to not care what the mainstream says, because the mainstream had always kind of rejected me anyway. And so I felt a good degree of indignation and was willing to walk. You think I might be a devil worshiper? Great. I'm not, but if you want to think that, feel free, And of course, Motley Crue dealt with a lot of that same ridiculous stuff as well, just by having that name, Shout the Devil. But it was a very important record for me, all the same. The number 2 on this decade was Iron Maiden's Live After Death. And I was a huge Iron Maiden fan through most of the 80s into the early 90s. That whole decade of my life. The musicianship, the storytelling, the narrations of the historical content. It's all really well-made music by players who are top-of-the-mark players. Steve Harris, Adrian Smith, uh, Dave Murray, Nico McBrain. Dickinson was a great singer. I've always liked the Dickinson years more than the Paul Di'Anno years, but I still enjoyed Killers in the first album as well. The Live After Death was a great live album from '85. That was a staple in my listening. It was kind of my entry into the band in a way, and it kind of pushed me back into their older work with the live versions of all those songs from Peace of Mind and Number of the Beast and Power Slave. And it was just a record that I still will go back and listen to and enjoy more than I will when I listen to Shout the Devil now. And then followed up by that shortly is Judas Priest Live. And JP Live, for fuck's sake. So Judas Priest Live comes out probably 87, 86 maybe. And it documents the Defenders of the Faith Turbo Lover tours. I think it's Turbo Tour actually from 85, 86. And Turbo Lover record, they introduced some synths and stuff. But there was a pop crossover accessibility to Turbo, Defenders of the Faith, even Screaming for Vengeance, that Priest didn't really have before that necessarily. I guess British Steel has a few kind of poppier tunes as well. But early 70s Priest is much different than their mainstream moment. And they actually broke into the American mainstream briefly with Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith and Turbo. And as a kid in 7th grade, that stuff was just right down my alley. And that live record, once again, introduced me to a lot of their back catalog and earlier stuff and being played in kind of a current context, so it sounded a little bit heavier than the original versions of some of those songs. And Parental Guidance, Living After Midnight, Breaking the Law, all those songs were big parts of my childhood. And I really enjoyed JP Live a lot. And it just, again, to make this list, these records have something I played a lot. And if I just played a song or two, you can't make this list. These records are the records I enjoyed from front to back consistently for a long time. Number 4 on this list is Appetite for Destruction, which comes out in 1987. And I stole that cassette from a music store on a church outing. Being a preacher's kid up in Winnipeg, I stole that and Anthrax Among the Living in 1987 on a church outing. You know what I mean, downtown Winnipeg. Almost got caught, too. But I got home and Appetite for Destruction. The cover was just compelling to me. And it wasn't really something I knew or heard much about. And this was before any of the singles had really broken. And we're probably a year still from Sweet Child of Mine tearing up the charts. So they get Paradise City and Welcome to the Jungle were out. Maybe Mr. Brownstone. Night Train kind of came out, and then, of course, Sweet Child blew it up a year later. All of a sudden, everyone was talking about that new Guns N' Roses band, which I had that cassette for over a year and already knew every word on it. And the amount of F-bombs on that record totaled more than the F-bombs I had heard on records before that point. Like it was really vulgar, but refreshing. And probably similar time frame, a couple years before that, I watched Eddie Murphy Raw. And I heard more F-bombs on that comedy stand-up piece than I'd heard in my life up to that point. I might have heard the F-bomb 30 times in my life. And all of a sudden, I'm 14, 15, watching Eddie Murphy Raw and Delirious. And it changed the amount of F-bombs I heard, motherfuckers. You know, just like Richard Pryor. But Appetite for Destruction is a brilliant, raw, hungry, necessary record. I'm not a big fan of Axl Rose and his politics and his... he's probably an asshole, you know. But that record to me was something that I remember busting dishes at Ponderosa and having that in my cassette Walkman, and just I knew every word to every dang song, from Welcome to the Jungle to Rocket Queen. I knew every word of those 14 songs. I think it was 14, maybe it's 12. But it's a great record, you know, and it had lots of hits on it, and it certainly stood the test of time, more so than the Use Your Illusions, which were kind of Elton John hard rock with pianos and strings and November Rains and all that. Appetite didn't wander down those avenues. It stayed hungry. Number 5 was Pantera's Vulgar Display for Power. That record was transforming. Everything that was hard before that wasn't hard anymore. Megadeth, Anthrax, Metallica, all that stuff that we like, yeah, that's the Edge's Master of Puppets. Vulgar Display of Power came, and Cowboys from Hell was all right. I like Cowboys, but Vulgar Display of Power came along, and it was just a kick in the teeth. It redefined what hard sounded like, and it took speed out of the equation and slowed it down. They were weed smokers as well as drinkers, so they were playing with Pocket and those riffs on Walk and Far Beyond Driven. The next record is also just incredible. 5 Minutes Alone and Unbroken, Becoming. But those two records, both, Dimebag was just one of the great players that takes from Van Halen, and he takes from Randy Rhoads, and takes from ZZ Top, and he's got the blues in him and some country rock. He's just a great player who writes great riffs, and you can't help but those riffs, you just fall into them. You don't have to like hard rock or metal to be able to shake your head to a lot of those Pantera songs. And that changed the face of metal for everybody. And changed the direction Metallica took on some level. But no one really ever mastered or matched Pantera for their intensity and the sheer adrenaline. I've seen them live 3 times back in the 90s, and Pantera concerts were something you won't forget. Number 6 on this list is Rattle and Hum. Right about this time, 1989, 1990, Rattle and Hum by U2 comes along, this live record, documenting the Joshua Tree album. I kind of heard a little bit of With You Without You, or With Without You, where the Streets Have No Name. Still not what I'm looking for from Joshua Tree. I was kind of aware of it. I had friends who were into it, but Rattle and Hum really hooked me. Love Rescue Me, with Bob Dylan's lyrics and B.B. King on there, and there's just some songs that have some real grit. And the Irish Constitution, which has plenty of soul and sorrow, matched with that kind of southern black soul sound that they were doing on Angel of Harlem and some of those Love Rescue Me tracks. Rattle and Hum just really, really connected with me. Van Diemen's Land, of course, was about Australia and the penal colonies where a lot of Irish got sent off to. The whole record, Heartland, just still sticks with me. All I Want Is You, just the whole thing. Bullet to Blue Sky, the version on Joshua Tree might as well not exist, because the version of Bullet to Blue Sky on Rattle and Hum, and then of course there was the movie to that as well, which was in the theaters, and I watched that concert a lot, listened to that tape, and that's eventually the CD, and eventually the vinyl a lot. And that record really changed me because it opens my ears to roots and kind of broadens what my horizons were going to become. And it definitely was a landscape-changing opening of the ears for me. And then number 7 on this list is Simon and Garfunkel. And I'm going to pick bookends, but I could really pick Sounds of Silence. I could pick Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. I could pick Bridge Over Troubled Water. I've enjoyed the first one a lot. The live concert in Central Park is great. But the songwriting, the melodies, the haunting harmonies of art, the lyrical content, the yearning of Paul Simon, the curious desperation of Paul Simon. There's a troubled nature to what he sings, but there's also a beauty and a haunting. And there's a lot of folk stuff from the 60s that just doesn't have the timelessness, at least to me, of what Simon and Garfunkel were about, what they did. And I could still listen to those records all the time. And so many great songs on those records from all those albums that are really life-changing records for me. And I don't know if you all remember the story, but my CD collection got stolen at one point. Someone axed our back door down and swooped up a bunch of CDs I just bought, including the Collected Works CD box set of Simon and Garfunkel. And I had to go down to a local record store to see if I could find my stolen CDs. I couldn't, but they had a bunch of used vinyl back in 1991, 92 that people were dumping off at the record stores. People didn't want the vinyl anymore. And so you could go to the Pink Floyd section, and there would be 6 copies of Animals, 5 copies of Relics, 6 copies of Works. I mean, the wall would have 5 copies of it. I mean, wish you were here. Pink Floyd was like that thick of used vinyl back in 92. The Beatles, the Stones, all those sections were plumb full of all the titles because everyone was getting rid of it like garbage. And and they were all $2, $3. And so I found the Simon & Garfunkel 5 albums and replaced the stolen CDs with those 5 albums. And Simon & Garfunkel had a couple deeper links for me. My senior English teacher, Mrs. Anderson, gave us the Sound of Silence in Scarborough Canonical, and we talked about some of that stuff in English class and literature class, in senior literature. And I was impressed by those songs, and then Scarborough Fair, and just wonderful content that she really challenged us as kids. And this was the only time that school system in America ever did to me, was introducing me to Simon & Garfunkel. But even before that, I had a friend from New Zealand, Simon, who had lived in Toronto, he lived in London, he lived in Frobisher Bay, which is now Aqualia in the Northern Territories of Canada. He had lived in Athens for briefly, lived in Christchurch and Dunedin in New Zealand for quite a long time. His stepdad was a sheep herder. He had seen Simon & Garfunkel in Toronto in the 80s, I believe. Probably the 80s. And they weren't doing a lot of concerts at that point. But fortunately, Toronto was a place where they would perform once in a while, like New York. And so Simon & Garfunkel is a precious part of my life. And I really adore their whole bodies of work. Number 8 on this list is Bob Marley Legend. And, sorry, it's not. It's Seasons in the Abyss by Slayer. 1990, 89, Seasons in the Abyss comes out. And it's probably 91, 92 where I really got into it. It's fast, it's lightning quick, it's got punk rock sensibilities with that thrash metal undercurrent. It's got lyrics that are topical and about problems in the world. I really like Dave Lombardo's drumming and used to play along to that record a lot on the drums. Fantastic fat thrash metal masterpiece album that still sounds as good today as it did in 1990 when it came out. Seasons in the Abyss is probably Slayer's pinnacle for me. South of Heaven's good, Rain and Blood's good, and stuff after that. There's some great moments, but Seasons of the Abyss was just this perfect moment, and the tracks on there are just wonderful songs. Dead Skin Mask is just a song that you'll never forget, and Seasons of the Abyss, that title track, Blood Red, Skeletons of Society. There's a lot of songs on that record I really related with lyrically, spiritually. There was a content to it that just I could identify with. And so Seasons of the Abyss was an important record, and I still listen to Seasons of the Abyss. It's a record I've always enjoyed and loved for a long time. So number 9 now on the list is Achtung Baby by U2. Probably the only band that's going to show up here twice is U2. Achtung Baby comes out in 1991, and it really changes the course of pop music in a lot of ways. That electronic synth pop, really well produced. Bono starts doing his falsettos. His influences become more varied. The band's sound really broadens. They recorded it in Berlin, and Brian Eno really helps push the boundaries of what U2 sounded like. They were much more earthy on Rattle Home and Joshua Tree and Under a Blood Red Sky, and all that earlier stuff was much more simple folk, and the production level just really escalates by the time they get to Achtung Baby. And it's one of the greatest records of that time, and probably of any era. It's got a lot of hits on it, from Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses to the Drac 1. So many great songs. A lot of big number 1 hits on that record. Number 10 on this list is Led Zeppelin 2. And I probably heard Led Zeppelin 4 first, but I started doing mushrooms and doing some LSD and Whole Lot of Love with that, and doing some whippets and stuff, the nitrous oxide and the hippie crack, as we called it, and Whole Lot of Love and a lot of that Zeppelin stuff, What Is and What Should Never Be. Those songs were just perfect for me in that moment of my life, and they were opening me up into my next chapter of diving back into classic rock and getting to know the roots of the hard rock I listened to in my teens. It was pretty evident by the time I was 20, 24 that classic rock was the precursor to the hard rock I loved. AC/DC and Aerosmith are rooted in the 70s with a lot of the Led Zeppelins and other bands of that time. So I really enjoyed Led Zeppelin 2. I love 3. I love Physical Graffiti. I love House of the Holy. 1's got some great stuff. 4 has some great stuff. But 2 was the one I really listened to a lot for about a year and a half. And I still have great memories of a time frame when I put Led Zeppelin 2 on. Number 11 is Bob Marley Legend. I remember the party I was at when I first heard Bob Marley Legend. And it was, a mixed party of punkers and goths and hippies and metalheads. And we were all, community and family, but musically we weren't very connected. One group wanted to hear Susie and the Banshees, one group wanted to hear Slayer, one group would want to hear Rage Against the Machine, Nine Inch Nails, Nirvana. There was a lot of things happening in music in the early 90s. And I remember how Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic, that was another thing that was really influential and a record I liked a lot. But when Bob Marley Legend came on at this party, I remember how it just brought everyone together, the Three Little Birds and all the happy contents and people singing along to these songs and feeling community and strength and love. And it was just, I was vaguely familiar with his work. You'd heard some of those songs here and there. But to hear the album being played at this party, my friend Greg Rhodes' house, it was transformative for me. It was just transformative. It was a record that changed my life. And I've never, ever tired of listening to Marley's records. And actually, he shows up again on the next chapter here. And the last album on this list was Rage Against the Machine, which that first record comes out in 1991 as well, or 92. And at the same party, that record came on right before the Bob Marley record. Rage Against the Machine got played. It was the first time I'd heard that record. And the content of the lyrics and the aggression of Zach and the compulsory anger that felt focused. I connected with it pretty quickly. I'm like, wow, that guy, he's pissed off, but he knows why. And I think that separates Rage from a lot of their contemporaries. A lot of metal bands are angry. Zach and Rage knew why they were angry. And as a kid, I connected with it. So that wraps up my teen years. As I turn 20, the landscape changes even greater, as we'll see.